Welcome to the Catholic Community Scripture Study, brought to you by St. John the Evangelist in Jackson, Michigan. I will be your host, Todd Gale, as we walk our way through the epic biblical stories of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Welcome to chapter 8 and 9. Angel did a wonderful job last week. Awesome, amazing, wonderful. What else? Insightful. Very good. Anything else? I know. That's why I'm just waiting to see. Okay. In first blush through chapters 8 and 9, I thought this was going to be flyover. There's a couple things happening. There's a couple little notes that are kind of interesting, some names and stuff. But I figured we would probably get through 10 and even 11 today, initially, really. Because I was like, there's just not that much there. Was I wrong? Okay, so we're going to pick up. Remember a couple sections back, I said this is not probably left in chronological order, right? Because the Jews really like thematic things more so than a storyline. So probably what happens this time of David's wars, going through actually the next couple chapters, probably happened first before he goes to Jerusalem, brings in the ark, and everything is peaceful. Because chapter 7, that awesome chapter you just looked at, begins with when the king dwelt in his house and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies, right? Well, immediately after the next chapters, he's not resting. There's a whole lot of wars going on. Probably most scholars think that part with the covenant actually comes a little bit later, but just thematically, that's how the author wanted to put it together. And that'll make a little more sense with something that we'll talk about here in a minute. So basically, chapter 8 is giving us a little background on some of the ways David is cleaning up the area, right? And he's expanding the kingdom. I want you to keep your eye on that. The kingdom is expanding beyond the original boundaries of Israel for the first time with him. In chapter 8, verse 1, David took Mephibosheth out of the hand of the Philistines. That's the first and last time, the only time we ever see that name. And scholars are like, they're not really sure what it is. I think our text note says, reference unknown. The parallel verse in Chronicles says, David takes the city of Gath. Do you remember Gath? That's come up a ton of times. What was in Gath? Yeah, Goliath. And it's like the headquarters of the Philistines. So what I found one Jewish commentary that made a lot of sense. Meteg in Hebrew, the first part of that word, meteg, means bridle. Like the bridle of a horse. So if you have a horse bridled, you have control of the horse, right? So they're thinking this is really a bridal city. It's probably Gath, meaning it's like the bridal city of all of the Philistine regions. In other words, it's the mother of all cities, right? It's the one that controls the other cities that belong to the Philistines. So by David taking this, he's really controlling all of the Philistine cities. Do you get that? This is kind of an interesting little, like why they don't use the same name they've used all along, that's scripture for you. It's really confusing.
The New American Bible.
Yeah, what does that say? No, it's blank.
It says, after this, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them. And David took ...
Oh, he took ... It doesn't even give the name.
What note says,
okay.
It says what you said. The original Hebrew seems irretrievable.
Yeah.
The transmitted text gives the bridle of the cubit.
Okay, the bridle of the cubit. There we go.
Understood as Gath and its towns.
Yeah.
Otherwise, implausibly read dominion of the capital city.
Okay, so it's the dominion of the... Ooh, how about that? So the Jewish rabbis are right. That's where I kind of followed that up with. That's awesome. Yeah, so sometimes in the New American Bible, rather than put a word in, they'll just do ... We ran into that earlier with 1 Samuel. Remember where it was like, David was ... years old or something like that? There's a couple times like that. They don't even try to fill in the blank sometimes, which is just the way that they translate it. But so he defeats Moab, which is kind of interesting Because when he defeats Moab, then he measures and puts to death 2/3 of the people. This has never been recorded before that anyone has done this in Scripture. And most historians say there's no record of anyone ever in the Middle East just drawing a line and saying whoever's on one side dies and whoever's, like, that's a really uniquely weird kind of thing. Why does David do that there? Nobody seems to know for sure. And the really weird thing is, if you remember Moab is not like a violent enemy to Israel, at least at this point. David's great-grandmother was a Moabite. Remember her story? Ruth. Ruth was from Moab. And back in chapter 22 of 1 Samuel, when David is fleeing in chapter 22, he is hiding in the cave of Adullam, and he takes his mom and dad and family to the Moabites to care for his family. So something happened that's not recorded where the Moabites are not friends with David anymore. Somewhere between the time of his parents hiding out with them and here, David doesn't like the Moabites, and he goes to war against them. And we're not really sure why or what happened.
Wasn't the Moabites that refused his food until his first? Wasn't that the Moabites?
Was that the Moabites, or that the Amorites, or was that the
I don't know who that was.
Pethazites, or the I can't remember. Possibly.
On a Jewish website called Chabad.org, they say that the Moabites killed his parents.
They killed his parents.
That might be.
Ooh, so that's like some kind of Jewish tradition, small case T, probably. Some story. Okay, awesome. Yeah, because I couldn't find anything. There's nothing scripturally. There's nothing that says. So that's interesting. So there's a Jewish legend, at least, if nothing else, that maybe his parents were killed by them. What's that? The Hatfields and McCoys. That would make total sense then as to why, because he treats them viciously, especially for David. This isn't like what he usually does. He lines them up and just basically kills 2/3 of them. Kind of interesting. He also defeats Hadadezer, or however you say that he did a great job, and restored his power at the river Euphrates. What's that?
That's a long way.
That's a long way. Why? What's the big deal about that, do you think? Does the note say anything about? Oh yeah, it does.
As far east as they were supposed to be able to go.
Yeah. So there is a little note. River, its upper course flows from Syria. David's interest in securing this area appears to be motivated by the Abrahamic covenant, which envisioned the promised land stretching all the way to the Euphrates. So exactly, in Genesis, when God gives Abraham like the layout of the land, he says from the Wadi of Egypt all the way to the Euphrates will be yours, which is kind of interesting because they don't really ever take the Wadi of Egypt all the way. But early on,
Is the Euphrates one of the three rivers in the Garden of Eden?
yeah, that's one of the ones that
Is that one of the
yep.
three ones that?
Yeah. And it's like just historically the Fertile Crescent, right? The birthplace of all civilization, right? So that's like, yeah, it's this beautiful area of land. And way back with Abraham, and then it's repeated in Deuteronomy and Joshua, that the land is going to be all the way to the Euphrates, will belong to them. David is the first one to take this land. Okay, this is really important. He's starting to actually, with Joshua and Judges, they kind of moved into some of the territory, and they got some of the territory, but as we see, even all the way through 1st and 2nd Samuel, they're still fighting with all the local residents, right, all the time. So it's never like a clear, clean spot where they've actually taken and have been in control of that territory. Now he not only does that, he's going to expand the territory. It says David put garrisons all the way to Damascus, which is on the side of the Mediterranean Sea, quite a ways north. It's north of most of all the tribes of Israel. Damascus, where have you heard that before? the capital of Syria. That's quite a ways north. What else do you know about Damascus? That's where Paul was headed to persecute Christians. So what's so cool historically, he stationed outposts in this territory. It's the first time Israeli control takes Damascus, where this is going to become a major Jewish settlement. All the way until way after the time of Christ. This is a major Jewish settlement. It starts here. Isn't that really cool? David is like planting his foot in Damascus. We're going to read about that centuries later. Paul wants to go there, and then he's on his way to Damascus when he has that encounter with Jesus, right? Later on, a lot of the Christians are staying in Damascus, and it's on the trade route up around to the European area. So David is continuing to expand his territory. And some of the kings congratulate him. Sometimes David takes gold and silver and all these wonderful prized possessions. In the time of Solomon, we're going to hear that Solomon takes a lot of these prized treasures, and they're going to end up being in the temple. Some of the gold and silver is melted for when they build the temple. King David dedicated all of these things that were purchased, all these articles of silver, gold, bronze, dedicated them to the Lord. And there's a lot of detail here and there with some of the names. At this point, I'm feeling like we've done names so much. I'm feeling like Father Mike Schmidt. So, what I wanted to look at was in verse 11 verse 14 and 15. It's kind of the summary verse of this chapter. The end of verse 14. And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. So David reigned over all Israel, and he administered justice and equity to all the people. All his people. Justice and equity. We have never seen anything like this with the 12 tribes, right? This is really different. One note, the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went, kind of hints to us like the traveling ark of the covenant. Wherever the ark goes, there God goes. Kind of the image, wherever David goes, there God goes, right? Wherever he goes, like he's being blessed. And he reigns over all Israel. Israel, the 12 tribes, are united for the first time, not only under a king who's like militarily got their backs and militarily kind of has the border defined, but this time he is ruling with justice and equality. There's no favoritism for Judah, for his tribe. There's no favoritism for one class over another class. It's what many, that these lines are what a lot of our founding fathers refer to in their documents, and a lot of the writings in the Federalist Papers. If you read anything by Hamilton or Jefferson or any of those guys, they all the time talk about a society that has equality and justice for all the people. This is where they're pulling it from. It's from David's kingdom. Isn't that awesome? Like, this is a really unique step forward in the history of humanity, to have a king who wants equality and justice. Now, he doesn't do it perfectly, right? Just like we never did in America either perfectly. But the ideal is there, and he's working towards it, and he's guided by God through this. And it gives us David's officers. This has a couple interesting things in here. There's a recorder. There's the Joab. Remember Joab? Just Joab, who slaughtered abnormal Abner, remember? And David wasn't really pleased with it. Even though David wasn't pleased with Joab, Joab retains his position as head over the army. Joab he wasn't booted, even though David didn't like what he did. That's kind of interesting. There's a recorder, and then there's a couple priests mentioned. One is Zadok. We're going to hear Zadok's name come up again much later in the time of Solomon. And there's also another priest, Ahimelech, son of Abiathar. Some translations have those two names flipped. Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech. And if you trace those names back from chapters ago, we come across those same priests and same names. They can't possibly always be in the same order because they would be super old at this point if it was the same guy. So there's probably like one son has got grandpa's name. And somewhere in there it got a little confused. And I decided it wasn't worth the energy to trace all that down. It really doesn't matter. But somewhere in there, they're all coming from the same families. But here's what's interesting. Jewish commentaries especially mention there are two high priests, Zadok, and whether it's Ahimelech or Abiathar, there's two high priests. Maybe because Zadok satisfies the south and Abiathar satisfies the north, or vice versa, however that works. One is probably for the north and one's probably for the south. David allows that to happen. But by the time of Solomon, Zadok is going to be the only high priest, and Abiathar is deposed by Solomon. David's son is going to kick him out of the priesthood. And we're not going to study that, that's later. But Zadok ends up being the high priest, and the high priest line that survives is going to come from Zadok. So it's kind of an interesting study. If you wanted to dive into that, I decided it's not that interesting to me. What do you think? Is that all right? Okay.
What is the time frame David reigned in? What BC?
It's around 1000 BC. So 970-ish, was it? They think something like 970 BC is when he started, something like that. For when David, what time period is this? It's around 1000.
Yeah, it's right around 1000.
Yeah, so it's between 970 and 990 probably, because he lives quite a while. He lives quite a while.
So this is a long time ago.
Yeah.
And we talk about these numbers. Are these numbers that get slewn?
Yeah.
And are they to be taken?
Probably not.
Probably.
Yeah, it's like what we've talked about before. With Jews, 1,000 means like just a bazillion, you know. So it's just a whole bunch. So they don't do numbers the way we do. It's much more poetic, and we've run into that many times in Scripture, right? Where sometimes the numbers, sometimes they just don't add up, and sometimes they seem fanciful to us. And they could be legit. They could be actual numbers. Probably they're more symbolic. And they probably just mean a whole bunch, like a whole bunch. So yeah, scholars argue over that all the time, like the numbers, because there's several that say there weren't even that many people like alive on the planet at this point in world history for the number of people that were slain by just the Jews, by the Israelites alone. So scholars argue that kind of stuff all the time. But in this, there's also a mention in verse 18. Benaiah is over the Cherites, the Kerethites, and the Pelethites. And we're going to see more about them a little bit later. There's our text note says they're foreign missionaries hired to serve as David's bodyguards. We're going to hear about them later on in chapters 15 and chapter 20. So hold that thought with those two names. I'm sure you'll remember it when we get there. The Kerethites and the Pelethites. And then it also says the last couple words, David's sons were priests. Really now? What's wrong with that thought? They're not Levites. Now remember, David acts as a priest, but why is that different for him? What's that? He's the anointed king of the holy city of Yerushalayim, right? Of Jerusalem. So he's a priest in the order of Melchizedek. Does he have the authority to anoint his sons to be priests?
Probably so.
Probably so. The problem is,
Two different things.
yeah, exactly. The problem is not every translation says they were named priests. Some say they were named, a prince or the chief official. Yeah. So Here's the interesting thing.
Looking at my interlinear, and every one of them says priest.
Does it really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, here's the interesting thing. The word on your interlinear, the word for priest is usually Kohan. Cohan, Kohan. Plural is Kohanite, or Kohanim, I am is always plural in Hebrew. So a Kohan is a priest. Kohanim means priest. Some rabbis teach here Kohanim does not mean priest, but the problem is nowhere else in the entire Hebrew Bible is it translated as anything other than priest. But it doesn't make sense to them, so they're like, he must be talking about some other role, a priestly type role or something. But in translation, it's always translated as priest when it says that. So for whatever reason, if David has 2 high priests, why couldn't he just appoint anyone else that he wanted to be the junior priests, to be the priests under them? It's possible. Remember, at this point, too, Israel and David seem to be a wee bit ignorant of the law of Moses, right? They seem to get a lot of things wrong because they keep forgetting to go back and read the law of Moses. So there's a lot of even the Jewish scholars are like, no, he doesn't mean priest, and the others say, well, yes, Kohanim is always priest. So even they kind of argue what that means. In the language, it looks like they were named priests. So it's a little bit interesting, but it's never mentioned again. We're never told anything about them exercising their priesthood. Kind of interesting. Chapter 9. Okay. The way that I'm going to pronounce the names, because it'll get so confusing if we start doing this, Mephibosheth, or Mephi, I'm going to call him Mephi for short. So Mephibosheth, okay? In other translations, he's called Meribal. In the New American, I think, it's Meribal, right? Yeah. The RSV, he's called Mephibosheth. And he's the son of Jonathan, who is lame. Because remember, they were fleeing when they were starting to kill everybody, and his nurse, or whoever it was, is running with little Mephi, and he falls and stumbles. They think probably severing his spinal cord is probably what happened, a spinal cord injury, and he can't walk anymore. Okay. David had made a covenant promise with Jonathan to do what? Take care of his sons, like his progeny. So keep that in mind. Here's where this is really, really interesting. They come upon this guy named Ziba, who is in charge of the house of Saul. Saul is dead. Saul is gone. Jonathan is gone. So here's this guy who has the plush job of just overseeing the estate of the king. Like, how good a job is this, right? And the thing is, Ziba means statue. So even though it never says anywhere, every Jew and every scholar I've looked at says he is a Gentile. Probably because of his name, like pagan statue idol. Statue like an idol. But usually you would not have a Jew take over the estate of somebody else in that, because they're going to be fighting for it and thinking they've got some claim to it. This guy's a Gentile. He's just hired hand. He's not going to try to put claim, they think. Right? That's one of the thoughts. So Ziba is this hired hand servant Gentile who's taking care of Saul's estate. And along with that, he's taking care of Mephi, right? Little Mephi with his broken legs, with his legs that don't work. But interesting, Mephi doesn't live at the house of Saul. Where does he live? In the house of Maker, the king of Amiel at Lodabar, it says in verse 4. What's going on here? Why is he not living with Ziba up there? Well, there's this subcontracted. There's this very interesting little thing we would never know if we read things in order the way we read in English Bibles, or if you read it in the way that the Jewish folks want to present it. But if we read it historically in order, we would find out something. And only through one little itty-bitty tiny note that I find this, and then it opened up a whole can of worms. Way later, in chapter 21, we come across 4 chapters that are an appendix, kind of slapped down at the end of 2 Samuel. Chapter 21, 22, 23, 24 are like appendixes. They're like extra notes, just kind of tagged on the end. But the problem is it's out of sequence. So if you read what happens historically in chapter 21, there's a setup that happens before chapter 9 that it totally changes the story. Ooh, are you excited? Okay. So chapter 21, I'm not going to make you read it. I'm just going to summarize it really quick. In chapter 21, it says David avenges the Gibeonites. So again, this is kind of out of sequence. The sons of Israel had sworn to spare the Gibeonites centuries ago, way back at the time of Joshua. There's a group of people called the Gibeonites. They had made a pact with the Gibeonites saying, we're not going to harm them. But Saul had sought to slay them in his zeal for the sons of Israel. So King Saul ordered a massacre of the Gibeonites sometime before he died. And the Gibeonites are going, whoa, dude, you made a covenant with us, and now you're killing us. So once Saul dies, the Gibeonites say, we want blood revenge. We want to kill the house of Saul. Make sense? So they come to David, chapter 21 of 2 Samuel. They come to David and they say, the man who consumed us, meaning Saul, let 7 of his sons be given to us so that we may hang them before the Lord at Gibeon on the mountain of the Lord. And King David said, I will give them to you. Isn't that interesting? David says, yes, you may take 7 sons of Saul and execute them. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son, Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord which was made between them. So the king took the 2 sons of Rizpah. Remember her name? I told you when we did this, you got to remember her name. Rizpah is the concubine that Abner was accused of going in and sleeping with. Remember this? Her name means hot coal. Remember? She's the hot coal concubine. She's not only hot, but she's going to burn you. Well, this is what happens. She ends up bearing 2 of Saul's sons because she's the concubine. 2 of her sons are among the 7 that are executed. So when Rizpah finds that when her sons are executed, she stays at their bodies. She keeps a vigil to guard the remains of the deceased sons. And her devotion so moved King David that King David then took all of the sons of Saul and buried them together with Saul and Jonathan. And kind of made like a royal grave site out of all that, right? So this is the setup before we get to chapter 9. David had allowed the Gibeonites to kill the sons of Saul, sparing one, sparing Mephibosheth. Okay? So with
Gibeonites come to David after Jonathan died?
Yeah, so this is after the death of Jonathan, and because they would have just gone after Saul, but Saul's gone. So he's like, okay, we want 7 sons then. Right? So this is sometime after.
Jonathan.
Yeah. So sometime after the death, sometime before that, obviously, he ordered the slaughter of the Gibeonites. They want blood revenge. David says, it's only fair. Go ahead. But you may not take Mephibosheth. Are you with me? So then it picks up chapter 9, totally different background to this chapter. So him asking the question, he already knows the answer, right? He knows there's only one left. And he wants to show him kindness, chesed, which is mercy. So I really want you to catch that because this is going to come up. He wants to show them mercy. This is David's promise. Oh, and Rochelle and Sue aren't here today. David's promise. So they're involved with, if you guys know Rochelle and Sue, right? Rochelle is involved with a group called David's Promise. I had no idea what this was about. It's this. This is where the group comes from. And it's a group of, it's not exclusively Down syndrome folks, but it's just people with all kinds of different, issues and disabilities and things. And that they're remembering the mercy that David shows to Jonathan. So the name of the group is David's Promise. Isn't that cool? It's so, and I never knew that. She was going, David's Promise is coming up. And I had no idea what they were talking about. So she had to fill me in on the story. And they're not here today. Darn. Anyway, so this is David's promise, that he will spare Mephi, right? He'll spare Mephibosheth. Now, but there's a servant whose name is Ziba. So why is he, okay, so this begs the question. The servant is there, but Mephibosheth does not live with him. Why? Because they probably fled to go into hiding so the Gibeonites wouldn't get them, because where would they look? They'd look at Saul's land, right? At his territory. That's probably why Mephibosheth is living in Lodabar. Was Ziba and is following what he knew what was supposed to happen with King David. He sends him away to be protected, right? Totally makes sense with that. That's why he's not living there with them. So King David sends and he brings him from the house of Machir, the son that lives in Lodabar, and Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, he falls on his face before King David. And David says, Mephi! Mephibosheth! And he answers, behold your servant. And David says, do not fear. Kind of interesting. Where do we usually see do not fear? When an angel appears, right? Why does David make really clear to Mephibosheth he doesn't have to fear? Yeah. Yeah. And what other nation in the world would the king not want to get rid of the former king's progeny, right? Yeah. Claim to the throne, absolutely. So normally any king would say, if you got claim to the throne, I want you dead. And he says, don't fear, but keep this in mind, because that fear is going to get played on in a minute with something that's really cool. Not from Mephibosheth and not from David. But he says, don't fear. I'm going to show you kindness, chesed, mercy, for the sake of your father. I will restore to you the land of Saul, and you shall eat at my table always. Now think about this. An Israelite being told by the king, the anointed one, I will restore you to your kingdom, to your land, and you will always eat at my table. Some really rich messianic ideas here, really rich Jesus stuff. The king telling the lame Israelite who has been away, you will return to your land. You will eat at my table. Whoa! Okay, that's not even half of it. So there's some great Jesus stuff kind of going on here. And he does obeisance and he says, what is your servant that you should look upon a dead dog such as I? Okay, what's he saying there? This is Mephibosheth saying that. Who am I? A dead dog that you would look upon me. Why is he saying that?
Oh, because he was disabled.
He's disabled.
He was unfit to be anything.
Exactly. In Jewish society, in Israelite society, you can't work. You can't serve. You can't move around. You have to walk everywhere there, right? They don't have wheelchairs. They haven't invented that yet.
So because he's lame, wouldn't they consider there's something sinful
Yes,
about it?
exactly.
That he is unworthy of anything.
So in Jewish thought, if he's lame, he did something sinful to earn it. Or his parents did something. Well, his parent did do something sinful, right? So he's like rejected from society, rejected from the temple. They don't have a temple yet, but right? Rejected from worship. He's totally the lowest of the low. And it's not just a dog, even lower than a dog. Like Israelites hate dogs. Have you seen in The Chosen when Matthew has a dog and everyone's just like, he's got a dog? They don't like dogs. That's just like, they just think dogs are creepy. What would be lower than a dog? A dead dog.
So,
Like that is like, he's just saying, I am nothing. Why would you do this for me?
so might
Okay.
Nephi have been sent away from Saul's territory for that reason as well? Not just
Yeah.
for protection, but because he's not worthy.
He's not even worthy to be there.
When
Yeah.
you look at notes about that town, it was not a nice place.
Which town? The
Lodabar.
Oh, Lodabar. Okay.
Yeah, it apparently translates into place of no pasture.
Oh.
Referred to as ghetto in other notes.
So isn't that interesting? So he is sent to the worst place, while the Gentile servant is living the high life, taking care of, which means he's overseeing it, which means he's not doing the work. Right? He's overseeing the estate. He doesn't even have to take care of the little lame boy anymore. Like he has no responsibility, it sounds like.
Did he send Mephi away?
It sounds, maybe, it doesn't tell us.
Because I think this overseer is a snake.
Yeah.
And I think basically.
Hold on to that thought, because we're gonna see something. Yeah, we're gonna see something. Ziba is not 100% good. He's not 100% bad, but he's not 100% good. There's some intriguing things that are gonna go on. This is really cool. So the king calls Ziba, Saul's servant, and he says, everything, this is verse 9, all that belonged to Saul and to his house, I have given to your master's son. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him and bring in the produce for your master's son to eat. So what's Ziba thinking?
Gigs up.
Crap, yeah, I've got to work for this now. It was never his to begin with. Okay? Now, there's a line in here. Oh, I wish so bad they hadn't translated it this way. It changes the history on the wording on the snake a bit. There's a line in here. So he says, David says, bring him here. You're going to take care of the land. Ziba had 15 sons and more servants. Then Ziba says to the king, according to all my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do. So Ziba says, okay, you command it, I will do it. End quote. And then it says, so Mephibosheth ate at David's table. If you look at the text note, the Greek says, ate at my table. So here's what one of the things I looked at that totally gives away how sneaky the Ziba is. That's not the end of the quote. In Greek, at least, in the original Hebrew, it reads like this. In Greek, it reads, Ziba says, quote, according to all that my lord the king commands his servant, I will do. Because Mephibosheth has eaten at my table like one of the king's sons already. End quote. Totally changes what he's saying. It's not his table. It was never his table, it was Saul's table. And what he's trying to say is, hey, be good to me. I've been taking really good care of this kid. He's been eating like a king all along, right? Do you get that little nuance in there? You move the quote.
He, in snake country over there, he put it in the hood.
Yeah.
He said, you know what, I'm going to eat high dog over here every once in a while, I'll throw you a scrap.
Yeah. He's been eating at my table. No, he's not. He's been living in the town of Lodabar.
Right.
He's not been eating at
Which
your table.
technically would be under him.
Right.
But not really his table.
Exactly.
But just.
So hold on to Ziba because it gets worse.
Yeah.
There's something that comes up here. So Mephibosheth has a son. So evidently he gets married. He has a son. His name is Micah. And all who dwell in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem from this point on. He ate always at the king's table. And in case you forgot, he was lame in both feet. They put that in again, just in case you forgot. Now, that's kind of an interesting thing, and I thought, well, that's kind of interesting little setup. I was just going to blow into chapter 10, and I just happened to catch one little note that said something about Ziba and Mephibosheth show up again later in 2 Samuel. Now look at this. Look at what happens. Oh, this is cool. Talk about character development stuff. Chapter 16. Now again, this is totally out of sequence, right? At least historical, chronological. It's out of sequence a little bit. So sometime after this is being set up. Ziba is now over the house. He's kind of working the land. But Mephibosheth lives in Jerusalem. Okay? So he's living in Jerusalem. Chapter 16 says, when David had passed a little beyond the summit, which probably means the Mount of Olives. So we're in like Jesus territory, right? We're in the city of Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives. Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, just shows up and meets him with a couple of donkeys loaded with bread and wine and raisin cakes and all kinds of stuff. Remember this, he has some donkeys loaded for a journey. Don't forget this. This is huge. And the king says, oh, how nice. Why did you bring these? How very nice. Ziba says, oh, I brought it for you and the king's household and the bread and the fruit for your young men. And the king said, and where is your master's son? Where's Mephibosheth? And Ziba says, oh, he remains in Jerusalem because he said, today the house of Israel will be given back to me, the kingdom of my father. What's he saying? Ziba says that Mephibosheth is saying what? Mephibosheth says, today's the day I'm going to take the kingdom back. He's like lame in Jerusalem, and he's right under David's face, and Ziba says, he's got all this pack mule filled with gifts for David, says, oh yeah, by the way, Mephibosheth is going to take the kingdom from you today. David is furious. And because of this, the king says to Ziba, behold, all that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours. Let that sink in. And Ziba says, what's that?
Did get paid by Ziba?
David said, or Ziba says, I do obeisance. Let me ever find favor in your sight, my Lord, my King. He bows down, butters him up, says a whole lot of nice things. What in the world? So if it ended there, we would be going, well, I didn't see anything in Mephibosheth that sounded like he was going to, what's going on? But it doesn't end there. In 2 more chapters, in chapter 19, 3 more chapters, chapter 19, David meets up with Mephibosheth. Get this. This is really cool. And if I didn't have I would have never seen this until we got to it. By the time we got to it, I would have forgotten all this other stuff. You know what I mean? I mean, we've probably I've read through this before. Never make any connectivity. Yeah, so chronologically, no, not before 9. So chapter 21 about the Gibeonites, that comes before 9. These come a little bit after 9. Because first there's the setup, and then he runs into one, and then he runs into the other. So this time, though, when David meets Mephibosheth, we're going to come to this a little later. There's a little bit of a strife going on with one of David's other sons, Absalom, if you remember the story. Absalom causes a little stink. In fact, he drives David out of the capital city for a period of time. So his son is basically trying to do a coup, which is what Mephibosheth was accused of, right? He's accused that he's going to try to take the kingdom. David's son, Absalom, tries to take the kingdom. It's this big, ugly thing. We'll get to this later. Big, ugly thing. David leaves the capital for a short period of time. When he comes back, though, he meets Mephibosheth. So this is chapter 19, paragraph 24. Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. Now, everyone in the nation is mourning because of this coup that fails Absalom, the son of David, I'm going to give it away, a little spoiler alert, he ends up being killed. and everyone's mourning. David's very, very upset about the whole thing. Mephibosheth shows up and has neither dressed his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king had departed. So from the day that David was driven out in the coup, Mephibosheth started to mourn. He hadn't shaved, sackcloth and ashes, that kind of thing. When he came from Jerusalem to meet the king said, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth? When I fled, why didn't you go with me into exile? Were you situating yourself to take my throne?" He doesn't say that. That's implied. "Why didn't you come with me? Because I heard from Ziba, were you waiting for this moment?" You get that? Like, that's the accusation. And Mephibosheth says, "My servant Ziba deceived me. For my servant said, 'Saddle a donkey for me, that I may ride on it and go with the king.'" So this donkey that came laden with all the stuff that Ziba says, "Oh, that was a gift from me to you," it was really supposed to be the ride that Mephibosheth was going to take to ride with David, his king. Do you get that? Oh, don't you hate him now? Talk about a snake. So he takes the lame guy's donkey with all the supplies. He has no way to get out of the city, so he's just going to mourn. He thinks his time's over. He mourns, but then David comes back. And he says, in verse 27, "He, Ziba, has slandered me," has slandered your servant, "to you, to the king. Ziba has slandered me to the king. But my lord the king is like the angel of God. So you do whatever judgment you think seems right to you." "All my father's house were but men doomed to death before you came along, King David. But you set your servant to eat at your table. What further right have I than to just cry to the king?" Totally humble. Nothing like what Ziba said. And the king said, this is so weird. David's response, what would you think his response would be? Yeah. Mercy on Mephibosheth, but I'm going to go get Ziba. No. You know what he does? The king says, "Why speak any more of your affairs? I've decided. You and Ziba shall divide the kingdom." And Mephibosheth says to the king, "Oh, just let him take it all, since my lord..." "Let him take it all because my Lord's come home. My Lord is safely home." What the heck is this about? So look at this in terms of the Messiah. The king, the Messiah, the anointed one, has a kingdom that's left to the Israelites who are broken and lame and powerless. And for a period of time, Gentiles rule the kingdom. And the Gentiles start to think the kingdom belongs to them.
What is David's response to that?
Yeah, well, David's response then, the Lord Jesus' response, is going to be, you overstepped Gentiles, but you still were part of the plan. And you were so lame, Israelites. You totally backed away, but you're still part of the plan. So the Lord says, I will split the kingdom between the servant Gentile and the lame Israelite.
But did David have any response after?
No, that's all he says.
No, I mean, after M says, give it all to him.
Nope.
It's still.
End of the chapter.
See, I was kind of looking at it, that's kind of
End of the
interesting.
chapter.
That's an interesting take, but I was also looking at it in the famous Solomon case.
Splits, yeah, sure,
When,
yeah.
when all of a sudden he says,
Who-
and the mother said, give it
Yeah.
to the other one, and he said, okay, she showed the true love.
So in this case, it's kind of what he's saying is, the king is saying, let's not split and divide, right?
Right.
And as far as dividing,
That's why I was wondering.
you're
what
gonna
David-
share.
That's why I was wondering what David said after
Yeah.
that.
He doesn't say
If
anything.
He would have been like Solomon saying, okay, I got the true mother.
David's final words are, you both get to share the kingdom.
And it's that equal and just.
And this, I can't pronounce.
Mephibosheth? Mephi?
Mephi. I know why you were emotional, because Mephi loves his kingdom. I mean, he loves the people in the kingdom more than he does, like, the
Yeah,
idea of him having half of it, because chances are there'd be
right.
fighting and all kinds of stuff. So he says, just let him have it all.
Who wants that kingdom?
No, it's not that, he's doing it for the
Yeah,
kingdom.
right.
You know, because he's
Yeah.
doing it because that's what's best for them,
I-
because he knows if he doesn't do that, they'll be.
I have you. I don't need the
I
kingdom.
don't need it.
It's trading.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Right,
It's trading the earthly treasure for the pearl of great price.
right, it's just like what he said.
Like, don't you wish whoever edited this would have put those stories together? Because there was one little note that just kind of said, oh, for further information about Ziba, I was like, well, I kind of wonder what happens to him. And there's probably a couple text notes that say chapter 16 and 19. I never would have done that follow-up. But what a fascinating story.
Thanks for joining us in the Catholic Community Scripture Study as we walk through 1st and 2nd Samuel.